The idea of family persists as a structure. This structure feels solid, a given. It is the bedrock upon which many lives are built, a presumed foundation for identity and belonging. This feeling of solidity contributes to a sense of expectation, a belief in the inherent permanence of roles and relationships. Discomfort emerges when this perceived permanence falters. A shift in behavior, a divergence from established patterns, can trigger disorientation. The anticipated framework dissolves, creating a space of uncertainty. This is not necessarily a result of negative events. It occurs simply because what was perceived as constant proves to be otherwise. The discomfort is proportionate to the degree of reliance placed on the assumed stability. This stability is presented through repetition. Interactions across years create predictable rhythms. These rhythms reinforce the idea of relational structures as fixed entities. Family histories become narratives passed down and reinterpreted. These narratives solidify the impression of continuity, linking present interactions to a perceived past. Yet observation reveals a different reality. Consider a parent's evolving response to a child's adolescence. Consider the subtle shifts in a sibling dynamic over decades. Consider the role a grandparent assumes, morphing with the changing needs and understanding of younger generations. These changes are not exceptional. They are intrinsic to the nature of interaction. They occur regardless of desire or intention. The sense of relational continuity arises from the human inclination to recognize patterns. The brain seeks order. It assembles fragments into coherent wholes. This process creates the illusion of a stable structure where one does not inherently exist. The perceived framework becomes a cognitive construction, a useful tool for navigating social complexities, but not a reflection of an underlying truth. The persistence of the illusion is maintained through social reinforcement. There is pressure to uphold the image of a stable family unit. Societal institutions, language, and rituals all contribute to this perception. Deviations from the expected pattern can be met with scrutiny or discomfort, further encouraging adherence to the assumed stability. However, the underlying relational dynamic remains fluid. External circumstances influence interactions. Internal growth alters perspectives. Generational differences create new understandings. Each individual within the perceived structure experiences their own personal evolution, influencing the collective dynamic. These factors combine to produce constant, subtle shifts. The feeling of familial belonging, then, rests on a foundation of constant change. The assumption of enduring relational structures obscures the dynamic processes at play. To recognize the relational dynamic as it is, a process, to observe the shifts and fluctuations, removes the expectation of permanence. This recognition does not invalidate experience, it merely clarifies the underlying conditions. It acknowledges the impermanence inherent in all relationships. The construct of family dissolves into a series of interactions. The framework of familial roles appears, from a certain perspective, to possess an inherent solidity. We observe these roles, parent, child, sibling, spouse, and perceive them as demarcations, fixed positions within a system of relationships. This perception generates an expectation that a person assigned a role will consistently embody qualities and behaviors associated with that role. Dissatisfaction can arise when this expectation is not met. It is not necessarily about failings, but the persistent pressure to maintain a performance. The initial assignment of roles, however, is not an objective determination. It originates from a dynamic process, a negotiation of needs and expectations. A child is designated a child, not because of an intrinsic quality, but because that label facilitates interaction, clarifies responsibility, and organizes a group's activities. The same individual, viewed through a different lens, might simultaneously be considered a caregiver, a student, or a dependent, each designation influencing expectations and behaviors. The apparent validity of these roles is reinforced through repeated performance. Each interaction reinforces the established pattern, creating a feedback loop that solidifies the perception of permanence. A parent consistently acting in a parental capacity strengthens the role's perceived definition. This cyclical reinforcement, in turn, shapes future interactions, confining them within the established parameters. The expectation of parental behavior reinforces parental behavior, creating a self-sustaining illusion of inherent characteristic. Societal expectations contribute to the perpetuation of this assumption. Cultural norms dictate specific behaviors for each role, influencing how individuals are perceived and judged. These norms operate as external pressures, encouraging role conformity and discouraging deviation. The desire to avoid social disapproval or gain approval further reinforces the adherence to predefined behaviors. The very act of assigning roles creates a system of anticipated behaviors. A caregiver, for instance, is expected to provide support. A child is expected to receive it. This expectation shapes the interaction, influencing actions and reactions within the defined space. The interaction itself contributes to the seeming solidity of the role. The assigned role, therefore, functions as a linguistic structure, a framework for interaction rather than a factual description. It is a verbal label applied to an individual to simplify relationships and coordinate actions. The performance of the role, repeatedly enacted, reinforces the perception that the role itself is real, independent of the individual. The constant enactment makes the framework seem substantial. This framework exists within conditions, contingent upon circumstance and perspective. The caregiver's role transforms in the face of changing circumstances. The child's role evolves with experience and maturity. These shifts demonstrate the fluctuating nature of the designations. The framework of familial roles is not a universal truth, but a locally generated construct. The assumption of objective roles, diligently maintained, proves to be a construct of continuous performance. The insistence that familial relationships possess inherent causes takes shape within the immediate experience of those relationships. It feels, initially, like a straightforward observation. Conflict arises, a pattern of behavior is exhibited, a person responds. These events seem to generate one another in a sequence, producing a readily apparent chain of consequence. The perception of this sequence lends the impression of independent origins. This impression solidifies when attempting to navigate difficult dynamics. When faced with disagreement, a desire to understand arises. That understanding is often sought through identifying initiating factors, pinpointing the trigger that set a course of interaction in motion. Labeling these triggers as causes allows for a sense of control, a framework within which to strategize and predict. A predictable structure offers the illusion of stability. The perceived validity of these inherent causes is then sustained by a preference for linear explanation. Human understanding tends to organize phenomena along a timeline, moving from beginning to end. This structure mirrors the expectation of a direct antecedent and a distinct consequence. Isolated events are weighed, dissected, and positioned along this timeline. Each position is assigned a causal role. The larger context of the relationship is minimized in favor of this sequential analysis. This focus on isolated elements further reinforces the assumption. A single instance of anger, for example, is framed as stemming from a single preceding event. The anger is not examined in relation to past experiences, present circumstances, or the accumulated history of the relationship itself. It is treated as a discrete occurrence, possessing an origin wholly separate from its surrounding conditions. The conditions, the intricate network of influences, are disregarded. Consider the appearance of resentment. It is frequently attributed to a specific action, a perceived slight, or a failure to meet expectation. The resentment is seen as arising that action, as if born independently of it. Yet, the action exists within a complex web of interaction layered with prior agreements, unspoken assumptions, and individual histories. The resentment is not generated the action alone, but emerges as a confluence of all these conditions. The conditions themselves are not static. They shift and alter with each interaction, influencing the very nature of the action and the resulting response. What appears to be a singular cause is, in reality, a convergence of many factors, each contingent upon the existence of others. Each event is a product of its immediate surroundings, its preceding history, and its potential future impact. Attributing inherent causes freezes this fluidity, transforming a dynamic process into a series of fixed points. The fluidity ceases, and with it, the capacity for genuine understanding. The reliance on linear explanations obscures the complexity of the interplay. The search for discrete origins obscures the pervasive interconnectedness. The insistence on independent causes ultimately dissolves when considered within the entirety of the system. The dynamic of familial relationship exists only as it exists. A discomfort settles. It is not a physical sensation, but a tension residing within the mind. This tension arises from the insistence on a specific form of familial behavior. A feeling of wrongness accompanies the divergence of actual behavior from the anticipated. The feeling itself is unremarkable. It is the belief underpinning it that warrants consideration. The belief holds that certain actions from family members are inherently due. It presumes an inherent correctness in the demand for a specific interaction, a particular expression, a designated role. This presumption exists irrespective of the demonstrable conditions that shape familial relationships. It is an assumption readily accepted, and its validity is rarely questioned. The origin of this belief is often rooted in the perception of need. A past instance of assistance may be interpreted as establishing a future obligation. Prior agreements, whether explicit or implied, reinforce the expectation. Culturally established notions of fairness further solidify the perceived justice of the demand. The framework feels complete, self-evident. Emotional investment sustains the belief. The desire for connection, the fear of rejection, the longing for validation, all coalesce to uphold the expectation. These feelings are powerful, and they obscure the underlying fragility of the assumption. Reciprocity is envisioned, a balancing of actions. This perceived balance legitimizes the demand and validates the dissatisfaction when it is absent. Social norms contribute to the maintenance of this expectation. Observations of familial interactions within the broader community offer examples. These external validations solidify the belief and discourage scrutiny. The assumption is not merely personal, it is shared, and it is reinforced by collective acceptance. The feeling of discomfort intensifies when behavior deviates from the anticipated. The disappointment is palpable, the frustration is genuine. Yet the source of the suffering lies not in the behavior itself, but in the rigidity of the expectation. The expectation is a construct arising from conditioned perspectives. It is a mental fabrication, no more inherently valid than a phantom limb. The expectation is not an immutable truth. It is a product of circumstance, a consequence of history, a result of conditioning. It has no independent existence. It is simply there, a pattern within the mind. The expectation is. The feeling of discomfort subsides as the expectation is recognized. The demand is noted, observed, and allowed to be. It is observed without judgment, without analysis. The feeling diminishes as the expectation dissolves. It is. The feeling of being a familial self is pervasive. It is the sensation of continuity, a feeling of being the same person who experienced childhood, who relates to parents and siblings, who carries a lineage. This feeling possesses an apparent solidity. It endures through shifts in circumstance, across years, and across interactions. It seems reasonable to assume a corresponding stability. The conviction of a stable, familial self arises from the persistence of recognizable patterns. Behaviors are repeated, memories are recalled, roles are maintained. The individual participates in recurring rituals, observes familiar landscapes, receives expected responses. These repetitions reinforce a sense of enduring presence. The idea of being fundamentally unchanged becomes readily accessible. This perceived stability is not inherent, it is a construction. Autobiographical memory plays a crucial role in this construction. The ability to recall past events allows for the piecing together of a narrative. Each memory, however fragmented, contributes to the sense of being a continuous entity. These memories are not static records, they are interpreted and reinterpreted through the lens of the present. Yet they serve to solidify the illusion of a persistent self. The need for identity cohesion further sustains the assumption. The human mind seeks patterns and connections. It attempts to create a unified and predictable picture of the individual. Disparate experiences are assimilated into a coherent narrative. Inconsistencies are minimized, contradictions are explained away. This drive towards a unified identity necessitates the belief in an underlying stability. Without it, the construction of a coherent self becomes untenable. Self-narratives reinforce the perceived stability. The individual constructs a story of their life, a story that explains their origins, their actions, and their aspirations. This narrative establishes a sense of purpose and direction. It provides a framework for understanding past experiences and anticipating future events. The narrative itself demands a stable subject. It cannot exist without a presumed actor at its center. The story depends on the feeling of being a familial self. Examining these processes reveals a dynamic, unfolding phenomenon. The individual is not a fixed entity. They are a shifting assemblage of experiences, perceptions, and relationships. Each interaction modifies existing patterns. Each new experience alters the present state. The person existing now is different from the person existing a moment ago. This difference may be minor, but it is undeniable. The language of being obscures the reality of becoming. The feeling of being a familial self is not a discovery of something pre-existing. It is a construction, actively maintained by cognitive processes. This maintenance requires effort, a constant reaffirmation of continuity. The feeling itself is conditional, dependent on memory, narrative, and the desire for identity. The assumption of a stable, familial self arises from a series of interdependent conditions. The conditions are not absolute. They are subject to change. The conditions are impermanent. The conditions are ultimately ungraspable. The familial self is a process. The belief in inherently real, idealized family relationships persists. It manifests as a certainty regarding the nature of kinship. This conviction feels valid because it offers a sense of ease. It provides a foundation for hope and a feeling of belonging. These feelings are often shaped by cultural narratives surrounding familial bonds. Stories perpetuate an expectation of unwavering support and unconditional love. These narratives establish a framework against which experience is measured. The maintenance of this belief relies on a fundamental desire for emotional security. This desire fuels a tendency to interpret interactions through a specific lens. This lens prioritizes evidence confirming the idealized model. Positive interactions are readily remembered and magnified. Negative experiences are minimized or dismissed. Discomfort arises when reality deviates from the projected ideal. This divergence creates a dissonance, an unsettling contrast between expectation and actuality. The strength of the dissonance is proportionate to the rigidity of the idealized belief. The perception of inherent reality is not objective. It is contingent upon specific conditions. These conditions include cultural conditioning and individual psychological factors. The desire for permanence influences the construction of idealized representations. Family relationships, like all phenomena, are subject to impermanence. The craving for permanence generates a longing for stability within relationships. This longing motivates the creation of an idealized version that promises enduring connection. The idealized version, however, does not reflect the fluidity of familial dynamics. This idealized version functions as a mental projection. It is a construct arising from the mind. It is not an accurate representation of reality as it is. The projection establishes a fixed image, removing the space for genuine change and growth. It establishes a boundary between what and what. This boundary becomes a source of ongoing evaluation. Every interaction is assessed against the fixed image. The assessment creates a framework of judgment, of deficiency. The feeling of belonging is contingent on adherence to this projected ideal. The feeling is not inherent to the relationship itself. The persistence of the belief resides in the avoidance of negative realities. Facing the inherent challenges of familial interaction is perceived as disruptive. It is perceived as undermining the sense of security the idealized version provides. Consequently, the idealized version is actively reinforced. Selective recall and interpretive biases sustain the projection. This reinforcement perpetuates the cycle of expectation and disappointment. The image remains intact, though it has no basis in actuality. It simply exists, a mental artifact sustained by a desire for something that is not. The idealized version is a projection. The expectation that familial validation will inevitably produce contentment operates as a persistent premise. It is a foundation upon which many construct a sense of well-being, a belief system centered on the perceived necessity of familial approval. The logic appears straightforward. Family, by definition, represents a primary source of belonging, offering a grounding in identity and a framework for self-worth. Disapproval feels like a severing, while acceptance feels like affirmation. This connection generates a readily understandable desire for recognition, a yearning to be seen favorably within the familial sphere. That desire is not generated in isolation. It is interwoven with internalized societal values. Cultures frequently emphasize the importance of family, framing approval as a cornerstone of a successful and fulfilling life. This reinforces the assumption that contentment is accessible through familial validation. The weight of expectation becomes a quiet pressure, subtly directing behavior and shaping self-perception. To deviate from familial norms, to resist expectations, can feel like a transgression against a fundamental principle. The perceived consequences of such transgression, disapproval, rejection, a sense of isolation, appear formidable. The power ascribed to familial validation is another sustaining factor. Family represents authority, tradition, and a sense of lineage. To be deemed worthy by this authority appears to bestow a legitimacy upon the individual. a confirmation of their place within the larger social fabric. The feeling of worthiness becomes contingent on the actions of others. It becomes a fragile construct, easily eroded by criticism or neglect. A perceived slight can trigger profound self-doubt. A moment of praise can create a temporary sense of buoyancy. This oscillation demonstrates the precariousness of contentment built upon external foundations. The structure of this expectation is inherently conditional. Familial approval is not a constant. It fluctuates in response to circumstance, mood, and individual biases. A parent's perspective shifts with age and experience. Sibling dynamics introduce layers of competition and resentment. Generational differences create points of friction. The very nature of familial relationships involves a constant negotiation of needs and expectations. The assumption of unwavering support is inherently flawed, a simplification of a complex and often turbulent reality. Furthermore, the individuals comprising a family are themselves subject to impermanence. Relationships evolve and sometimes dissolve. Generational transitions inevitably disrupt existing patterns. Loss, separation, and disagreement are unavoidable aspects of the human experience. Seeking contentment solely through familial validation is therefore tethering oneself to a source characterized by constant change. The pleasure derived from approval diminishes as it is recognized as a temporary state. The potential for disappointment amplifies with each instance of conditional acceptance. This realization destabilizes the initial premise. The belief that contentment is secured through familial validation proves unsustainable under scrutiny. It lacks inherent resilience. The sense of individual agency frequently appears as wholly distinct from familial dynamics. This perception arises from a common experience, the feeling of making choices, of acting independently. Individuals observe their actions, register intentions, and understand themselves as originating those intentions. This feeling solidifies the idea of agency as a bounded entity, separate from external forces. The appearance of this separation reinforces itself. Emphasis placed on individual intentions further obscures the interconnectedness. Analysis typically begins with the actor, with the decision made. Conditions preceding that decision are often relegated to background details. Explanations rarely examine the formative influences that shaped those intentions. The desire for self-control, the aspiration to be the sole author of one's actions, strengthens this perception. It reinforces the need to believe in a core self, a locus of unconditioned will. The feeling of agency is not invalid. Action occurs. Choices are made. Yet the assumption of complete distinction creates a conceptual boundary where it does not fully exist. This boundary then functions as a limitation. It restricts understanding of the forces shaping action. It obscures the ways in which actions are interwoven with complex contextual factors. Family history, for example, establishes patterns of interaction, communication, and expectation. These patterns are not simply historical data, they constitute an ongoing field of influence. Cultural norms dictate behaviors and shape values. Interpersonal relationships foster specific responses and expectations. These factors act as conditions influencing the emergence of intentions and the execution of actions. They are not simply modifiers of a pre-existing will, they are elements within the process itself. Consider the seemingly straightforward act of choosing a career. The individual weighs options, assesses abilities, and considers future prospects. This process is presented as a demonstration of individual agency. However, the very idea of what constitutes a desirable career, the perceived value of specific skills, and the comfort level associated with certain professions are all influenced by familial expectations, cultural narratives, and past experiences of success or failure. The individual's perceived autonomy is predicated upon a foundation of inherited beliefs and social conditioning. The discomfort that sometimes arises from this disconnect manifests as a tension. The individual feels a pressure to reconcile the perceived need for independent action with the knowledge that influences exist. This tension can lead to frustration, a sense of being constrained, or a feeling of inauthenticity. A striving for complete control becomes a perpetual endeavor. The assumption of complete distinction is sustained by a focus on the initiating moment, the point of apparent origination. This focus ignores the ongoing flow of causality, the web of interdependence that constitutes every action. It allows for the illusion of a self, isolated and independent. It creates a framework where actions appear to arise from a singular source. But the reality is a constant interplay. The action arises within and through a network of conditions, familial, cultural, relational. This is not a diminution of agency, it is a more accurate description of its nature. The separation fades as the conditions are examined. The sense of a distinct, bounded self within a family structure frequently presents as a given. This perceived separation is experienced as concrete, a foundational element of familial existence. It manifests in the assignment of roles, parent, child, sibling. Obligations and expectations attached to these roles, further solidifying the notion of individual containment. The system functions, ostensibly, because of these clear demarcations. Discomfort arises when this perceived solidity encounters reality. A child might feel stifled by parental expectation, a parent burdened by a child's need. Siblings may experience resentment born of perceived inequity. These instances, common and predictable, reveal a fiction that the assumption of impermeable boundaries cannot fully resolve. The desire for personal space, for independent action, clashes with the reality of shared history and intertwined fate. The dissonance produces a subtle, pervasive unease. This disquiet reinforces the very assumption it challenges. The perceived need for distance, for control, becomes an argument for the validity of the boundary itself. It is rationalized as necessary self-preservation. The desire to avoid emotional entanglement is presented as a sign of maturity, a defense against vulnerability. Hierarchical structures are upheld as necessary to maintain order, to prevent chaos. Each element, in its own way, sustains the illusion of separation. However, consider the inherent conditionality of the perceived boundary. The roles assigned are not intrinsic properties. They are agreements, however tacit, within a system of reciprocal influence. Parental expectation arises from a desire, however flawed, for the child's well-being. A child's need is a response to perceived lack. Resentment between siblings stems from a comparative judgment, a weighing of perceived value. Each appears as individual impetus, yet each is born from interaction. The notion of a self, complete and self-contained, is itself a construct. It is a narrative woven from experience, a pattern imposed upon a ceaseless flow of sensation and perception. The familial self, even more so, is shaped by interaction. Identity is not an isolated entity, it is relational. It exists only in the context of other identities. The space between parent and child, sibling and sibling, is not a void, but a field of constant exchange. Communication, even indirect or unspoken, bridges these supposed divisions. Shared experience, whether joyful or painful, creates a common ground. The very act of defining a role necessitates a recognition of another. The need for autonomy is predicated on the existence of an other who can be distanced. The maintenance of hierarchy depends upon a perception of difference. Every element designed to reinforce separation simultaneously reveals the interconnectedness it attempts to deny. The persistence of this mistaken assumption leads to unnecessary suffering. The rigidity of boundaries restricts growth, inhibits compassion, and perpetuates misunderstanding. The very structures erected to provide stability become sources of tension. The notion of a contained self within a contained family dissolves upon closer examination. It is a fiction, useful perhaps for momentary expediency, yet ultimately unsustainable. Boundaries, then, are constructs, not inherent. The assumption of familial permanence holds a considerable sway. It manifests as an expectation, a silent agreement regarding the nature of relationships. It is the understanding that bonds forged within a family structure endure, essentially unchanged, across time. This expectation creates a foundation upon which countless actions and decisions are built. The validity of this assumption appears readily demonstrable. Familial connections frequently involve protracted commitments. Individuals dedicate years, decades even, to nurturing those ties. Shared history accumulates, forming a collective narrative that reinforces the sense of continuity. Events, experiences, and routines bind people together, creating a palpable sense of shared existence. The weight of these factors suggests a solidity, a resistance to alteration. Cultural narratives contribute significantly to the reinforcement of this expectation. Loyalty to family is often presented as a core value, a defining characteristic of a virtuous person. The potential for loss, for the severing of these connections, generates a persistent anxiety. The desire for stability, for a predictable and secure environment, strengthens the inclination to view family as a permanent fixture. These narratives are woven into the fabric of societal understanding, solidifying the notion of familial endurance. This perception, however, is dependent upon a conceptual framework that prioritizes permanence. It requires a selective observation of reality, an overlooking of the inevitable processes of change. Everything exists within a flux, a constant state of becoming and unbecoming. This principle applies equally to the most seemingly steadfast relationships. The individuals involved undergo their own individual transformations. Circumstances shift, external pressures arise, and internal perspectives evolve. The accumulation of history, initially a source of validation, subsequently becomes a catalogue of alterations. What was once a shared understanding may diverge into separate interpretations. Roles shift, expectations change, and the original framework begins to unravel. This divergence can manifest subtly as a gradual distancing or abruptly as a decisive break. The form of the change is irrelevant to its presence. The discomfort that arises is not inherent to the change itself. It is a product of the prior expectation, the clinging to a perceived stability that never existed. The effort to maintain an illusion generates resistance, friction, and ultimately dissatisfaction. This discomfort is not a consequence of familial dissolution. It is a consequence of believing in permanence. The feeling arises precisely because the assumption is not confirmed. The concept of a permanent family unit is a construction, a mental projection imposed upon a reality that is inherently fluid. It is a framework created for ease of navigation, and that framework, by its very nature, obscures the underlying truth. The perceived strength of familial bonds arises from shared investment, not from inherent properties. These investments, like all things, are contingent upon conditions that inevitably alter. The recognition of this condition does not require judgment, it simply requires observation. The expectation dissolves into the simple acknowledgement that all things are in motion. The impulse to assign blame within familial relationships presents itself as a natural response to perceived injustices. It feels necessary. It provides a structure for understanding events that cause distress. A feeling of wrongness exists, and the mind seeks a source for that wrongness. Identifying an individual as the origin of that feeling offers a sense of resolution, however temporary. This impulse, however, rests on a flawed foundation. The assumption that injustices within a family are solely attributable to the actions of a single person is a simplification of a far more intricate reality. It appears logical on the surface, offering a seemingly straightforward explanation for complicated dynamics. This appearance of validity is precisely the obstacle. The appeal of assigning blame resides in its perceived ability to create order. It delivers a narrative, action, reaction, consequence. This narrative, while comforting in its neatness, prevents a deeper investigation. It creates a false sense of control within circumstances inherently resistant to control. The need to understand suffering, particularly that experienced within close relationships, generates a powerful pressure to find a cause. A cause must be isolated, defined, and then judged. This need reinforces a particular perspective. The narrative of the victim gains strength from identifying a perpetrator. It validates the experience of pain and validates the feeling of being wronged. To deny the perpetrator is to deny the validity of the victim's suffering, a proposition often deemed unacceptable. Yet, the very act of pinpointing a single cause prevents recognition of the multitude of contributing factors. The assumption persists because the alternatives are less appealing. Acknowledging the complexity of origins, the confluence of histories, unspoken expectations, ingrained patterns of behavior, and subtle shifts in emotional climate is far less satisfying than pointing a finger. It requires a sustained effort to observe without judgment, a practice demanding considerable patience and intellectual humility. It asks that one relinquish the satisfying ease of judgment. Consider the family as an ecosystem. The health of the entire system depends on the interaction of all components. The actions of one element invariably affect others, often in unpredictable ways. To attribute a dysfunction to one part of the system is to ignore the interconnectedness of the whole. It's to believe that removing a single leaf will alter the shape of the tree without accounting for roots, soil, and sunlight. The framework of individual blame actively obscures the intricate web of conditions that give rise to any particular event. These conditions are not always visible or easily articulated. They are often unconscious, inherited, or learned through repeated interaction. They are dynamic, constantly shifting, and mutually influencing one another. To insist on a single origin point is to deny the fluidity of the system. It freezes it in time, halting the process of adaptation and change. Therefore, the feeling of injustice, the desire for accountability, while understandable, arises from a faulty premise. The apparent logic of individual attribution dissolves upon closer examination of the interplay of contributing conditions. It is a convenient fiction, a narrative crafted to alleviate discomfort, but ultimately it reinforces the very suffering it seeks to resolve. The framework itself is contingent. The feeling arises a certainty that the course of a family can be directed. It is not a pronouncement, but a quiet conviction residing within action. Individuals act, they speak, they arrange. These actions seem to produce results within the familial sphere. A child is guided, a disagreement is mediated, a pattern is ostensibly altered. This reinforces the initial feeling. The feeling is predicated on the idea of outcomes. Outcomes are understood as states of being, relational positions, or inherited characteristics. These outcomes are seen as possibilities, susceptible to influence. The feeling gains strength through repeated association, action followed by observable shift. The connection is not necessarily causal, but the appearance of correlation is sufficient to sustain the feeling. The desire for control manifests. It is not a grand ambition, but a pervasive impulse. It surfaces in adjustments of routine, in the wording of advice, in the subtle pressure applied to choices. This desire stems from a longing for predictability. Life, and by extension, familial life, appears chaotic. The impulse to exert control attempts to impose order upon this perceived disorder. Belief in personal efficacy feeds the feeling. The individual believes their actions possess weight, their words possess force. This belief is established early, often through successes in other domains. The successes, however tangential, are generalized, lending credibility to the notion of influence. The individual sees their agency elsewhere. They assume it functions similarly within the family. Frustration sustains the feeling. When expectations are unmet, when intended outcomes fail to materialize, a sense of inadequacy arises. This inadequacy is interpreted as a failure of control. The action is re-examined, the strategy revised, the effort renewed. The cycle repeats, fueled by the desire to rectify the perceived deficiency. The assumption of control is conditional. It relies on the visibility of outcomes, the persistence of action, and the maintenance of belief. Any disruption to these conditions weakens the assumption. An unexpected event can render an action inconsequential. A shift in perspective can reveal the limits of influence. The erosion of belief can dismantle the entire structure. The feeling is not inherently wrong. The actions it motivates are not necessarily detrimental. They are simply rooted in a mistaken premise. The premise is that a family, like any complex system, operates under principles of predictable causality. This premise is demonstrably incomplete. It excludes elements of chance, of temperament, of the interplay of countless independent factors. The feeling persists despite the gaps in the premise. It persists because the feeling itself generates more action, more observation, more reinforcement. The cycle feeds upon itself, creating the illusion of efficacy where none exists. The individual focuses on the actions taken, the adjustments made, the interventions implemented. The focus obscures the deeper currents shaping the familial landscape. The pursuit of control produces reactivity. The individual reacts to perceived deviations from the intended course. They adjust, they correct, they redirect. These reactive actions create their own momentum, often amplifying the initial disruption. The attempt to steer the family becomes a dance of consequence, a perpetuation of the very patterns sought to be altered. The certainty dissipates, the feeling fades. It leaves no void, no absence. It simply ceases to be. The individual continues to interact within the family, but the assumption of control is no longer present to guide those interactions. The feeling is gone, and the actions simply proceed. The sense of familial obligation frequently arises as an unquestionable imperative. It appears as a natural expectation, a debt to be repaid. This perception is often experienced as a weight, a pressure directing action and shaping choices. Discomfort arises when one considers deviation, when the prescribed course seems unsustainable. Yet, the origin of this perceived obligation is not inherent. Societal structures consistently reinforce the notion of familial duty. Cultural norms articulate specific roles and expected behaviors within family units. These frameworks dictate actions, define responsibilities, and prescribe patterns of interaction. They are presented as foundational, existing independently of human agreement. This presentation lends an appearance of universality to what is in fact a localized construct. The feeling of obligation intensifies with the awareness of potential consequences. Disapproval from family members generates anxiety. Anticipation of social censure amplifies the perceived stakes. Deviation risks disruption of established relationships and the erosion of perceived standing within a community. This fear serves to maintain adherence to prescribed roles. Furthermore, the internalization of familial values contributes to the persistence of this belief. Early conditioning establishes patterns of thought and behavior. Repeated reinforcement solidifies expectations. These internalized values are experienced as intrinsic motivations, as arising from within oneself. They are mistaken for personal convictions. The individual identifies with them, believing them to be an essential part of their identity. The continued operation of this assumption is sustained by the acceptance of traditional roles. These roles, ostensibly timeless, are in reality historical artifacts. They represent specific arrangements established within particular contexts. Their relevance is contingent upon the continued acceptance of those contexts. They are not, therefore, immutable principles. The assumption of inherent duty allows these roles to endure beyond their original purpose. Consider the expectations placed upon an individual to provide care for an aging parent. These expectations are not universal truths. They are influenced by economic factors, cultural traditions, and individual circumstances. The demands placed upon the individual are dependent upon the availability of alternative resources. They shift based on prevailing attitudes towards elder care. They are responses to specific conditions, not demands dictated by the cosmos. Observe that the obligation itself is reliant upon the agreement of those involved. It is a transaction, however tacit, predicated on mutual understanding and willingness. When those understandings change, so too does the perceived obligation. It is not a fixed quantity, but a variable reflecting shifting circumstances. The strength of the perceived duty directly correlates with the level of agreement among participants. This perspective clarifies that familial obligation is not an inherent characteristic of human existence. It is a socially constructed phenomenon, shaped by context and dependent upon agreement. It exists because people believe it exists, because they act as if it exists. The weight of perceived duty diminishes with the recognition of this construction. The expectation loses its power when seen for what it is, a product of collective belief. The imperative simply ceases to be. Familial obligation is demonstrably a human creation. The assumption of direct causality within familial conflict holds considerable weight. It appears self-evident, particularly when observing recurring patterns of interaction. A statement is made, a reaction follows, a consequence arises, and the sequence seems unbroken. The connection feels intrinsically logical, a clear progression from origin to result. This offers a certain comfort, a semblance of order within a system that can often feel chaotic. Dissatisfaction arises, however, when this framework proves inadequate. Blame is assigned, expectations are unmet, and the perceived chain of cause and effect becomes a source of further friction. The appeal of this assumed causality resides in its simplicity. It provides a readily available explanation for complex dynamics. Human beings tend to seek explanations. Uncertainty generates unease. Attributing cause and effect, even superficially, alleviates this unease, granting a false sense of control. A predictable sequence, even a negative one, can seem preferable to a void of understanding. This predisposition for linear thinking reinforces the initial assumption. It encourages a search for singular origins, a focus on immediate antecedents, while obscuring the myriad contributing factors. The perceived validity of the causal link is not inherent to the events themselves. It is a product of perception. Each individual brings a history of experiences, beliefs, and expectations to the interaction. These pre-existing conditions shape how the events are interpreted. What one person perceives as a direct response, another might view as a delayed reaction or no reaction at all. The significance ascribed to a particular word, tone, or gesture is not universal. It is contingent upon individual understanding. The human mind operates within a network of conditioned responses. These responses are built over time based on previous experiences, learned behaviors, and societal influences. They dictate how information is processed and how meaning is extracted. A childhood trauma, for example, might lead one person to interpret a neutral comment as a hostile attack. Another, with a different history, might perceive the same comment as benign. These divergent interpretations generate distinct causal narratives, even when the stimulus is identical. The assumed chain of cause and effect, therefore, is not a reflection of objective reality, but a construction born of subjective experience. The reliance on linear causality obscures the fluidity and interdependence of events. It privileges a singular point of origin, when the truth is far more diffuse. Multiple factors, often subtle and unnoticed, contribute to any given outcome. Attributing causality to a single action, a single statement, is an oversimplification that fails to account for the complexity of human relationships. The search for a root cause, a definitive origin, becomes an exercise in futility. The certainty associated with assumed causality diminishes with closer examination. It is a provisional framework, susceptible to revision upon considering alternative interpretations. It is a lens that colors the experience, rather than a transparent window revealing the underlying reality. The perceived link between events is contingent, fragile, and ultimately dissolves under scrutiny. The pattern itself ceases to exist.